Hello, and welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, leave a comment below and let me know. I love seeing where these stories find you. If slow, haunting tales that carry you gently towards sleep are something you enjoy, consider liking and subscribing so more of these can find their way to you. Now, get comfortable. Let your body grow still. Let the outside world fade into silence. Tonight, as the night grows quieter, the shadows begin to whisper, and another haunting story unfolds. So, close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into this. I took the lighthouse job because I needed to disappear for a while, and I want to be honest about that from the start, because everything that happened afterward makes a strange kind of sense once you understand how badly I wanted to vanish. My mother had died 3 months earlier. Cancer, slow and then suddenly not slow at all, the way it goes sometimes, lingering in the bones until it decides it's done lingering. I hadn't cried once, not at the hospital, holding her hand while the machines went quiet one by one like lights switching off in a house at the end of the night. Not at the funeral, standing in the front row in a black dress that didn't fit right anymore because I'd stopped eating properly, watching my sister sob into our aunt's shoulder while I stood there dry-eyed and rigid, feeling like a stranger at my own mother's burial. Not after, in the weeks that followed, when the casseroles stopped coming, and the phone stopped ringing, and the house sat empty, and smelling faintly of her perfume, which I couldn't bring myself to wash out of the pillows. My sister called it cold. She used that word more than once, in that clipped, wounded voice she gets when she's decided something about you, and there's no arguing her out of it. "You're so cold, Ren," she said, the last time we spoke, 3 weeks before I signed the contract for Merrow Point. "You didn't even cry. What is wrong with you?" I didn't have an answer for her then, and I don't know that I have one now. Grief didn't come to me the way it was supposed to, in convenient, visible waves that other people could witness and validate. It sat somewhere lower down, somewhere I couldn't quite locate, coiled tight, like something waiting for permission I hadn't given it yet. Maybe I was afraid that if I let it out even a little, it would take everything with it. Maybe I just didn't know how anymore. I'd spent so many years being the practical one, the one who handled things, who called the oncologist and filled the prescriptions, and sat up through the bad nights, while my sister processed her feelings out loud to anyone who'd listen. Somewhere in all that handling, I think I forgot how to feel things in real time. I only ever felt them later, sideways, in dreams I couldn't remember upon waking, in a tightness behind my sternum that no amount of deep breathing seemed to loosen. So when the recruiter called about Merrow Point, I said yes before she'd even finished describing the position. "A 9-month keeper's contract," she said. "Mostly automated systems these days. Mostly just maintenance and monitoring. Mostly solitude." The pay was good. Better than good, actually. Generous enough that I wondered briefly why nobody wanted it. Though I didn't ask, because I didn't want an answer that might make me reconsider. The isolation was the entire point. 9 months where no one would ask me how I was doing in that particular tone people use. The one that expects a certain kind of answer and gets visibly uncomfortable when you don't provide it. 9 months where I wouldn't have to perform grief for anyone. Wouldn't have to explain my dry eyes at the funeral. Wouldn't have to disappoint my sister by being exactly the person I actually was, instead of the person she needed me to be in that moment. No one to disappoint. That was the phrase that kept looping through my head as I signed the paperwork, as I packed a single suitcase and locked up my apartment and gave my landlord a forwarding address that was really just a coastal town too small to have its own zip code. The agency mentioned, almost in passing, that the previous keeper had left the position early. "Personal reasons," the woman on the phone said, in a tone that suggested she'd been told to say exactly that and nothing more. I remember the slight pause before she said it, the way her voice flattened out, professional and careful. I didn't ask for details. I told myself it didn't matter. Burnout, probably, or a family emergency. or simple loneliness getting the better of someone less prepared for solitude than I believed myself to be. I had my own reasons for wanting to disappear, and I didn't have room left over to worry about someone else's reasons for leaving. That was a mistake, I understand now, though I don't know that knowing would have changed anything. I don't know that I would have turned back even if she'd told me everything, because by then I had already decided that Merrow Point was where I needed to be, a blank grey nothing of a place where my grief could finally do whatever it needed to do without an audience. I remember the drive out vividly, more vividly than I remember most of the months that came after, which is its own kind of strange when I think about it now. The coastal road narrowed gradually as I went, the trees thinning, the guardrails growing rustier and more infrequent, until eventually there was just cliff on one side and grey water on the other, and a fog that came rolling in off the ocean thick as wool, swallowing the road 10 feet ahead of my headlights. I remember gripping the steering wheel and feeling something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time in months. Not happiness, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of relief. The relief of driving toward a place with no history, no expectations, no one who had known my mother and would ask me, gently, how I was really doing. I remember thinking, quite clearly, good, let it swallow me a while. I meant the fog. I think some part of me also meant the whole arrangement, the isolation, the ocean, the coming winter. I wanted to be swallowed. I wanted, for a little while, to not have to be a person that anyone was watching. I didn't know yet that Merrow Point had its own history of swallowing people in ways far more literal than I could have imagined that night on the coastal road, windows fogging with my own breath, radio picking up nothing but static the closer I got to the water. The lighthouse came into view around a final bend in the road, and I remember pulling over just to look at it for a moment before continuing on, the way you might pause before entering a room you already suspect is important. It stood white and peeling against a sky the colour of an old bruise, purple-grey and heavy with clouds that never seemed to fully clear during my time there. The tower itself was taller than I'd expected from the photographs the agency had sent, rising up out of a rocky promontory that jutted into water so dark it looked less like the ocean and more like something spilled, something that had pooled there rather than belonging there naturally. Beside it, huddled low against the wind, sat the keeper's cottage, small, stone-built, with a slate roof and shuttered windows that gave it the look of something crouching, something trying to make itself smaller against whatever weather came off that water. The caretaker was waiting for me at the cottage door when I finally parked and made my way up the gravel path, suitcase in hand, wind tugging at my coat with a persistence that felt almost personal. He was an older man, weathered in the particular way that people who live near cold water get weathered, deep lines around his eyes, and a permanent squint that suggested decades of staring into salt spray. He introduced himself briefly. I want to say his name was Callum, though so much has blurred since then that I'm no longer entirely certain, and handed me a heavy ring of keys without much ceremony. What I remember most clearly, more clearly than his name, is that he would not meet my eyes. Not once, through the entire handover. He looked at the door, at the keys, at some point over my left shoulder toward the water, but never directly at me, and I noticed it the way you notice small wrongnesses that you don't yet have a name for. "Radio's in the kitchen," he said, walking me through the basics in a clipped, efficient voice, the voice of a man reciting something he'd rather not be reciting. "Fuel lines checked monthly, logs on the counter, weather comes in fast here, faster than you'll expect, even if you've lived by the coast before." He paused at the threshold, one hand still on the door, and something in his posture changed, a kind of stiffness, a bracing. "Keep the light going," he said. "Keep the door locked, you'll be fine." Keep the door locked. I actually laughed a little. Later that night, alone at the kitchen table, with a mug of tea going cold in front of me, wind moaning around the eaves of the cottage in long, low notes that sounded almost like breathing. I laughed because it had struck me, in the moment, as such an odd thing to emphasize, as if I were staying in a rough part of a city rather than on an isolated rock miles from the nearest town, where the only visitors were meant to be gulls and the occasional supply boat. I didn't laugh for very long, though. The longer I sat with the memory of how he'd said it, not as casual advice, not as the kind of thing you tell any new keeper as a matter of routine, but low and tight, almost urgent, like a man passing on a rule he'd learned the hard way, the less funny it seemed. There had been something underneath his words, something he wasn't saying, a shape visible only in the space around it, the way you can sometimes tell the size of an object by the shadow it throws, even when the object itself stays hidden. I spent that first night unpacking, moving slowly through the small rooms of the cottage, trying to make the space feel like mine, even though every surface still held traces of whoever had lived there before me. A coffee ring on the counter, a chip in the paint by the stairs, a smell that was not quite mine and not quite anyone's I could identify, something faintly metallic underneath the dust and salt. I told myself this was normal. Every rented space carries its ghosts, in the mundane sense. Other people's habits worn into the furniture, other people's choices in where to hang a mirror or how to arrange a shelf. I told myself I would make it my own soon enough, given time, and I believed that, mostly, because I wanted to. I climbed the tower before bed, just to see it, just to stand at the top and look out at the black water stretching in every direction, the beam sweeping slow and patient overhead, cutting through fog that never seemed to fully lift, even on the clearest nights. There was something almost meditative about it, that steady rotation, that mechanical certainty in a place that otherwise felt entirely uncertain. I remember standing there a long time, hands on the cold rail, watching the light do its work, thinking that maybe this place would be good for me after all. Simple, honest, nothing asked of me except to keep a flame burning for ships that might never come. I didn't yet understand that the light wasn't only for ships. I didn't yet understand what else, out there in the dark water, had learned to watch for it too, and to wait, with a patience that made human patience look like nothing at all. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully enough that I began to relax into the rhythm of the place, waking early, checking the lamp mechanism, logging the weather, walking the short rocky path along the promontory while the light was still climbing over the horizon. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed, though I didn't understand at the time that this was the moment the shift had begun. I was at the kitchen table, eating a late dinner alone, a spoon halfway to my mouth, when I heard it. A low, wet knocking against the cottage door. 3 slow raps, evenly spaced, deliberate in a way that immediately distinguished the sound from wind or debris or anything accidental. I froze completely. The spoon stayed suspended in the air, soup cooling on it, my whole body gone rigid with an instinctive alertness I hadn't felt in years, not since childhood, not since the specific fear of things that come in the night that most of us are taught, eventually, to reason our way out of. There were no footsteps before the knocking. I want to stress that, because it's the detail that has stayed with me most vividly. No crunch of gravel on the path outside, no scrape of boots on the stone step, nothing to suggest a person approaching in the ordinary way people approach doors. Just the knock, arriving out of silence, as though whatever had made it had simply been standing there already, close enough to the door that I should have heard it, and hadn't. And then, after the knocking stopped, there were no footsteps leaving either, just the wind, picking back up as though it had paused politely to let the knock be heard, and then nothing. A long, ringing nothing that somehow felt worse than the knock itself, because at least the knock had been a sound with a shape, something my mind could try to categorize and dismiss. The silence afterward had no shape at all. It simply sat there, heavy, waiting. I told myself, in the minutes that followed, all the reasonable things a person tells themselves in that situation. It was a branch, I thought, tapping against the door in the wind, except there wasn't a single tree within a mile of the cottage. nothing but rock and scrub grass, and the low, salt-stunted bushes that grew close to the ground near the cliffs. Nothing tall enough or rigid enough to produce a sound like that. It was the pipes, I thought next, settling in the cold the way old plumbing does in old buildings. Except the knock hadn't come from inside the walls, hadn't had that muffled, structural quality. It had come from the door itself, or from just outside it, close and deliberate and aimed. I did not open the door. I want to be honest that some part of me considered it, in that first disoriented moment, the instinct to investigate, to reassure myself with direct evidence, is a strong one, and I've always been a person who prefers to know rather than to wonder. But something held me in my chair, some older and more animal part of my brain that recognized, before my conscious mind caught up, that this was not a situation that called for investigation. I sat with my back against the wall, as far from the door as the small kitchen allowed, and I watched the door handle in the low lamplight, waiting for it to turn, my spoon and my dinner both forgotten and cooling on the table in front of me. The handle never turned. I sat there until dawn began to grey the edges of the kitchen window, my body aching from stillness, my eyes dry and burning from refusing to blink for longer stretches than should have been possible. But even though nothing moved, even though the handle stayed perfectly, unnaturally still, I felt watched the entire time, a pressure against the back of my skull, a sense of attention being paid to me from somewhere just beyond the door, patient and unhurried. The way a predator watches prey, it isn't ready to move on yet. I have tried, many times since, to explain that feeling to people who weren't there, and I've never managed it adequately. It wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear, it was the specific, bone-deep certainty of being observed by something that did not experience time the way I did, something for whom an entire night of waiting cost nothing at all. When morning finally came fully, grey light spilling weak and reluctant across the kitchen floor, I made myself get up and check the door. Nothing. No marks on the wood, no scuff in the dust on the step outside, nothing to suggest anything had ever stood there at all. I remember standing on that step for a long time, coffee going cold in my hands, looking out at the flat grey water, and telling myself it had been the wind after all, some trick of acoustics unique to the shape of the cottage and the angle of the cliffs. I wanted very badly to believe that. I did not entirely succeed. The smell arrived the following week, and it announced itself so gradually that for several days I genuinely couldn't have told you when it started, only that at some point I noticed it had become a constant presence rather than an occasional one. It began as an undertone beneath the ordinary brine smell of the coast, a smell I'd grown used to almost immediately, the sharp, clean scent of salt water and wet rock that I'd come to find almost pleasant, grounding, proof that I was somewhere real and far from everything I'd left behind. But underneath that clean brine, something else began to surface, faint at first and then less faint, something sweeter, cloying almost, rot-sweet, in a way that reminded me unpleasantly of fruit left too long in a bowl on a warm counter, that particular fermented sweetness that sits just before full decay, when the sugars have started breaking down, but the smell hasn't yet tipped over into anything you'd immediately identify as rotten. I noticed it most strongly near the shoreline rocks below the lighthouse, the jagged outcropping where the tide pooled and receded twice daily, leaving behind tangles of kelp and the occasional stranded creature, crabs mostly, sometimes small fish, once a gull that had died there and lain bloating in the sun for 2 days, before I worked up the nerve to dispose of it properly. I assumed, reasonably enough, that something larger had washed up somewhere among those rocks and was decomposing out of sight, tucked into some crevice the tide hadn't fully exposed. The smell was worst at low tide, which supported that theory. Worse when more of the rocky shelf was exposed to open air. Better when the water rose and covered whatever was producing it. I found myself avoiding the cliff path that ran closest to the water, taking the longer route around the back of the cottage instead when I needed to check the fuel lines that fed the lamp, telling myself it was simply more pleasant to avoid the smell, nothing more significant than that. I mentioned it, almost in passing, during my scheduled radio check-in with a woman named Ines, who handled coordination for keepers along that stretch of coast, and who I spoke to briefly most mornings. A voice I came to rely on more than I would have expected, given how little we actually said to each other beyond weather reports and fuel readings. "There's a smell down by the rocks," I told her, keeping my tone light, conversational. "Something must have washed up and died. I keep meaning to go look, but honestly, it's pretty unpleasant." There was a pause before she answered, brief but noticeable, the kind of pause that suggests someone choosing their next words with more care than the conversation would seem to warrant. "Happens," she said finally, her voice flatter than usual, stripped of the mild warmth she usually carried, even through the radio's tinny distortion. "Don't go looking for it." I remember sitting with the radio handset still in my grip for a moment after she said it, turning the sentence over in my mind, trying to decide whether I'd imagined the strangeness in it. Don't go looking for it. Not, you don't need to, not, it's not worth the trouble, but a flat, direct instruction, delivered in a tone that closed the subject, rather than opening it to further discussion. Her tone made me want to push, want to ask what exactly I might find if I did go looking, want to ask whether this had happened to previous keepers too, whether there was a pattern here that she was declining to name. But there was something in the silence that followed her words, a held breath down the line, faint static filling the space where more explanation should have come, a sense of someone on the other end deciding, actively, not to say more, that made me let it go instead. I told myself I was reading too much into a tired coordinator's clipped response at the end of a long shift. I let it go the way you let go of things you're afraid to have confirmed, the way you avoid asking a doctor a follow-up question because some part of you already suspects the answer and isn't ready to carry it yet. The smell never fully went away after that, not for the rest of my time at Merrow Point. It ebbed and flowed with the tides, sometimes faint enough to ignore, sometimes strong enough to make me gag while doing routine maintenance near the shore. I stopped mentioning it to Ines. I stopped, mostly, investigating its source, contenting myself with the theory of some unlucky sea creature decomposing in an inaccessible crevice, dying slowly out of sight the way things do, unnoticed, unremarked upon, until the smell of them is the only evidence anyone ever gets that they existed at all. I think now that some part of me already suspected the smell wasn't coming from anything so simple, so natural, so easily explained. I think some part of me had already begun to understand that Merrow Point kept things close to its rocks, that did not follow the ordinary rules of decay, and that the sweetness under the salt was not the smell of something dying, but of something that had found a way not to. It was the same week, only a few days after that unsettling exchange with Ines, that I heard my mother's voice for the first time, and I want to describe this carefully, because it is the memory that still catches in my throat more than any other from that entire 9 months, more than the knocking, more than the smell, more than anything that came later and was, by any objective measure, more overtly frightening. I was up in the lamp room that afternoon, working through routine maintenance on the rotation mechanism, my hands deep in the gears, grease under my fingernails, sunlight, what little of it made it through the perpetual haze over Merrow Point, slanting weakly through the glass around me. It was ordinary work, mindless and grounding, the kind of task that let my thoughts wander without requiring much of my attention. That was when it drifted up through the stairwell below me, soft, indistinct at first, and then unmistakably clear. A voice, her voice, calling my childhood name, the pet name only she had ever used, the one my sister had teased me about relentlessly as we got older, and I'd asked her, eventually, to stop using it altogether. Ren. Just that. Drawn out slightly, in exactly the tone my mother used to use calling me in from the yard for dinner, warm and a little exasperated, and entirely, achingly familiar. I dropped my tools. I don't remember deciding to move. I simply found myself already halfway down the spiral stairs, calling back, my voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard it crack since the week she died, my heart slamming against my ribs with a force that I recognized, even in the moment, as something other than pure fear. It was hope, terrible, aching, undignified hope, the kind that makes a grown woman with a business degree and a healthy skepticism about the supernatural go running down a spiral staircase toward a voice she knows, on some deep and rational level, cannot possibly be real, because the alternative is worse than believing in ghosts. The alternative is admitting that hope like that simply has nowhere left to go. The cottage was empty when I reached the bottom, of course. Every room, checked twice, 3 times, my hands shaking as I opened closet doors and looked behind furniture like a child convinced a monster is hiding somewhere logical. Nothing, no one, just the wind, which had picked up considerably outside, whistling through a gap in one of the window frames in the kitchen, a gap I hadn't noticed before and made a mental note to seal, though I never got around to it, in a way that, I told myself eventually, standing in the empty kitchen with my pulse still hammering, could sound like a voice if you wanted it to badly enough. Whined through a narrow gap, pitched just right, shaped by the geometry of an old stone cottage, into something almost like a word, almost like a name. I wanted badly enough. That's the part I keep returning to, the part that frightens me most in retrospect, more than any monster ever could. I wanted to hear her voice so badly that I was willing, in that moment, and honestly in the weeks that followed, to let a coincidence of wind and architecture stand in for her, to let myself believe in something impossible rather than sit with the plain, flat fact of her absence. Grief does that, I think. It makes you susceptible in ways you don't expect, opens a door in you that you didn't know was there, a door that things can walk through if they know the right shape to take. I didn't understand yet how literally true that would turn out to be at Merrow Point. How something out there had learned, over years, over decades even, exactly what shape to take in order to walk through that door in exactly the people most likely to leave it open. I found the previous keeper's logbook almost by accident, wedged behind the boiler in the utility closet off the kitchen, where it had apparently slid and been forgotten, water-stained along one edge from some old leak, its cover swollen and soft with damp. Most of the pages were illegible by the time I found it, ink bled and smeared, whole entries reduced to grey smudges I couldn't make sense of no matter how long I squinted at them under the kitchen lamp. But near the end, in the last dozen or so pages, the water damage lessened enough that several entries remained clear, written in a hand that grew progressively less steady as the dates progressed, letters slanting further and further from vertical, pressure inconsistent, as though the person writing them had been losing something, sleep, certainty, control, with each passing week. One entry stopped me completely. I remember reading it 3 times before I fully absorbed what it said, the words seeming to rearrange themselves slightly each time, though of course they hadn't. It was my understanding of them that kept shifting, kept trying to find a way to make the sentence mean something other than what it plainly meant. It knows what you want to hear, the entry read, the handwriting tight and cramped, as though the writer had been pressing the pen hard enough to nearly tear the page. That's how it gets you outside. Don't answer. Don't ever answer. The date beside that entry was 11 months old. I sat on the kitchen floor with that logbook open in my lap for a very long time after reading it, the cottage groaning and settling around me in the way old buildings do, wind finding its usual gaps and turning them into low, tuneless notes that I now listened to with an entirely different kind of attention than I had before. I thought about the voice in the stairwell, I thought about how easily, how immediately, how completely I had run toward it, my feet already moving before my conscious mind had caught up enough to ask any of the questions it should have asked. I thought about how much I still wanted to hear it again, not despite what I now suspected about its origin, but almost because of it, because some hungry, grieving part of me had already begun rationalizing reasons why it might be worth answering anyway, might be worth the risk, if there was even the smallest chance the voice really was some fragment of her, reaching for me the way I'd been unable to reach for anyone since she died. That frightened me more than the knocking ever had. The knocking, at least, I could hold at arm's length, could categorize as external, as something separate from me that I needed to defend myself against. But this wanting, this willingness to entertain answering, even after reading a stranger's desperate, water-damaged warning not to, this came from inside me, and I didn't know how to defend myself against something that was using my own grief as its point of entry. I read the rest of the legible entries that night, searching for more context, more explanation, anything that might tell me what exactly it referred to, what shape it took, what had ultimately happened to the keeper who'd written those words with such visible, deteriorating urgency. There was nothing more. The entries simply stopped, mid-page, the final one trailing off mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted, or had simply run out of whatever reserve of composure had let them keep writing at all. I checked the agency's file later, the brief note about the previous keeper leaving for personal reasons, and I understood, with a cold certainty that settled into my stomach like swallowed ice, that whatever had happened to them, it had not been the kind of personal reason anyone would want to write down in an official record. I tried the radio the next morning, fully intending to ask Ines directly about the previous keeper. Not obliquely, not testing the waters the way I had with the question about the smell, but plainly, because I had decided overnight that plain questions deserved plain answers, and I was owed at least that much, given what I was apparently dealing with. Static answered instead. I assumed, at first, some routine interference, a storm somewhere along the transmission path, and tried again an hour later, and then again that afternoon, at each of the scheduled check-in windows we'd established during my first week, windows I'd come to rely on more than I realized, until they were suddenly, inexplicably empty. I tried for 3 days straight, at every scheduled check-in without exception, and got nothing but that same hollow hiss each time, that particular texture of static that has a strange way of sounding almost alive if you listen to it long enough, patterns emerging and dissolving in the noise that your brain insists on trying to interpret as meaning, even when you know, rationally, that it's nothing. Occasionally, in that static, I thought I heard something that might have been breathing, slow, deliberate, too rhythmic to be simple interference, though I told myself repeatedly that this was my imagination working overtime, primed by everything else that had happened, finding patterns and threats in noise that was, in reality, exactly as meaningless as radio static usually is. Occasionally it might have been the ocean itself, some trick of the transmission picking up ambient sound from somewhere along the relay chain. I genuinely don't know. I've turned it over in my memory so many times since that I no longer trust my own recollection of what I actually heard versus what I've since convinced myself I heard. Grief and fear having a way of retroactively editing memory that makes it hard to separate the two. The isolation, which had once felt like exactly the relief I'd signed up for, the blessed absence of anyone asking how I was really doing, anyone watching my face for the grief I was supposedly failing to display, now sat on my chest like a physical weight, a stone I carried everywhere through the cottage and up the tower and along the cliff path I still mostly avoided. I began talking to myself, quietly at first and then less quietly, just to hear a human voice in the space, my own voice serving as a kind of tether to a version of reality that felt, increasingly, like it was drifting away from me a little more each day. My voice cracked more with each day that passed, thinning out into something unfamiliar, something that didn't sound entirely like me anymore, though I couldn't have said exactly what had changed about it, only that it had. I thought often, during those 3 silent days, about calling my sister. I had her number memorized, had it sitting there in the part of my mind that never fully lets go of the people we've hurt or been hurt by. And more than once I picked up the satellite phone the agency had left for genuine emergencies and held it in my hand, thumb hovering over the call button, before setting it back down again. I told myself it wasn't an emergency yet. I told myself I didn't want to worry her over something that was probably just a mundane equipment failure on Inez's end, some downed relay tower, some bureaucratic reshuffling that had temporarily left me without a point of contact. I told myself a lot of things in those 3 days, most of which I no longer believe were the real reason I didn't call her. The real reason, I think, was that some part of me still didn't want to be the person who needed help, who admitted she was frightened, who broke the careful, cold composure my sister had already decided defined me. Even alone on a rock in the middle of the ocean, apparently haunted by something that had learned to speak in my dead mother's voice. Some old and stubborn part of me still cared more about not looking weak than about staying safe. I understand now how dangerous that particular kind of pride can be. I did not understand it then. I saw it on the 9th night, during a brief lull in the fog that had otherwise blanketed the coastline almost continuously since my arrival. A shape crouched on the low rocks near the tide line, visible only because the moon had broken through the clouds for perhaps 90 seconds, just long enough to illuminate the shoreline in cold, flat silver light before the fog rolled back in and swallowed everything again. I was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of tea I wasn't drinking, unable to sleep, unable to do much of anything except sit with the growing weight of everything I'd learned and everything I hadn't been able to confirm, when I saw it. It was pale, first of all, pale in a way that didn't quite match anything I could immediately categorize. Not the pale of human skin in moonlight, not the pale of driftwood or bleached shells, but something colder and more uniform than either, as though whatever it was had never been exposed to sun at all, and it was too long in the limbs, proportioned wrong in a way that took my mind a moment to fully process. The way your eye sometimes needs a beat to catch up when something looks almost right but isn't. The head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop the instant I registered it properly. Not the natural tilt of a person looking at something, but something more extreme, more deliberate, as though the neck itself worked differently than a human neck should. It wasn't moving toward the cottage. That was the detail that struck me most, standing frozen at that window with my tea going cold in my hands. It was simply crouched there, on the exposed rocks near the tide line, watching the tower, watching the light, specifically, its slow, steady rotation, the beam sweeping out across the water and back again, on its unbroken cycle. It watched the light the way you might watch a fire on a cold night, transfixed, drawn in by something that seemed to hold a kind of meaning for it that I couldn't begin to guess at. I remember thinking, in the strange, detached way your mind sometimes works during genuine shock, that it looked almost reverent, almost worshipful. I killed the kitchen lamp immediately, some instinct telling me that darkness was safer than light in that particular moment, that being visible to whatever crouched on those rocks was worse than being blind myself. I stood in the unlit kitchen and watched the tower, my whole body gone rigid and cold, minutes stretching out with an elasticity that made it impossible to judge how much time was actually passing. When the beam swept around and crossed the shoreline directly, illuminating the rocks fully for the fraction of a second it took to pass, the shape was gone. Not hidden, I want to be clear about that distinction, because it matters and because I've turned it over in my mind endlessly since. Not ducked behind a rock, not slipped into a crevice, not retreated the way something startled might retreat, given a half-second of warning, simply gone, absent. The space where it had been crouched, now containing nothing but wet rock and the retreating edge of the tide. The way a held breath disappears the instant you finally exhale it. Not gradually, not through any visible process, just there and then, conclusively, instantly not there. I did not sleep at all after that. I sat up in the kitchen until dawn broke fully, and even after that, even with grey daylight filling the cottage and making everything look ordinary and explicable again, I did not want to close my eyes anywhere near a window. I moved my sleeping arrangement to the small windowless pantry off the kitchen that night, and for several nights after, curling up on a nest of blankets on the floor between shelves of canned goods, feeling, absurdly, safer surrounded by tinned soup and old flour than I had felt in the actual bedroom with its view of the water. The mailboat came on the 10th day, considerably later than its usual schedule, and I remember feeling an almost embarrassing surge of relief at the sight of it cutting through the fog toward the small dock below the cottage. Proof that the outside world still existed, still remembered I was here, still occasionally sent tangible things my way that weren't voices or shapes or unexplained silences on the radio. Among the usual supplies, fuel canisters, a box of groceries, replacement parts for the lamp mechanism I'd requested weeks earlier, there was a letter addressed to me in my sister's handwriting, the first contact I'd had from her in months, since well before I'd even accepted the Merrow Point position. I sat on the dock and opened it immediately, ignoring the cold wind cutting through my coat, more eager for those few pages than I would have expected, given how badly our last conversation had gone. She wrote that she'd finally started going through our mother's things, a task she'd been putting off for months, the same way I'd been putting off feeling anything about it at all, each of us managing our grief through our own particular species of avoidance. In a box of old correspondence, tucked into the back of a closet our mother had apparently kept locked for as long as either of us could remember, my sister had found a stack of old letters, decades old, the paper yellowed and brittle, addressed to a lighthouse keeper at a place called Merrow Point. I read that sentence 3 times before it fully landed. Our mother had been here, not recently, not in any way either of us had known about. My sister wrote that the letters dated back to a period well before either of us existed, before our parents had even met, when our mother would have been young, barely out of her teens by the dates on the postmarks. She'd left in a hurry, apparently. The letters suggested some sudden, unexplained departure, references to packing quickly, to not being able to say goodbye properly to someone, to something she wouldn't name even in writing, to whoever she'd been corresponding with. My sister, who had no idea about anything I'd experienced in the preceding 10 days, asked almost as an afterthought, tucked into the letter's final paragraph, whether the place felt strange to me. She said she didn't know why she was asking. She said reading those old letters had just given her an odd feeling she couldn't quite name, and she'd wanted to check in, wanted to know I was okay out there alone. I sat on that dock for a long time after reading it, the letter shaking slightly in my hands, though whether from the cold or from something else, I couldn't have said with confidence. Everything I'd experienced over the previous 10 days reorganized itself in my mind, all at once, into a completely different shape. My mother's voice in the stairwell hadn't been comfort, hadn't been some coincidental trick of wind and architecture that my grieving mind had simply chosen to interpret generously. It was memory. It was something at Merrow Point that had known my mother once, decades ago, that had learned the exact shape and texture of her voice from direct exposure rather than from anything I had unconsciously supplied it. And it had mistaken me, her daughter, arriving alone and grieving and vulnerable, for a way back to her. Or perhaps it hadn't mistaken anything at all. Perhaps it had recognized something familiar in me the moment I stepped off the boat, some resonance, some inherited echo of the woman it had once known and never fully let go of, and had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to use that resonance against me. Once I understood that my mother had a history at this place, I couldn't stop myself from searching for more of it, and I spent the better part of the next 2 days in the tower's base level, where decades of old logbooks were stored in mildewed cardboard boxes stacked along the curved stone wall, records going back further than anything I'd found in the previous keeper's more recent notes. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a working lighthouse's records: weather patterns, fuel consumption, gull counts, occasional notes about passing ships or minor equipment failures, the accumulated mundane detail of decades spent maintaining a single steady light against an indifferent ocean. But scattered through those decades, appearing every 10 or 12 years like clockwork in different handwriting each time, different keepers, presumably unaware of their predecessors' identical experiences, I found the same phrase, or close variations of it, recurring with a regularity that made my skin crawl once I recognized the pattern. Heard the voice again tonight, sometimes elaborated slightly, sometimes just that bare sentence, dropped into an otherwise ordinary entry about weather and fuel levels, as though the writer hadn't quite known how else to record it, hadn't wanted to give it more weight on the page than they were willing to give it in their own mind. And then, in one particular logbook, its pages more brittle than most, ink faded nearly to invisibility in places, I found something that stopped my breath entirely. A name, written in a shaking hand in the margin of an otherwise unremarkable entry. My mother's maiden name, the one from before she married my father, the one I only knew from old documents and the occasional story she'd told about her early 20s, a period of her life she'd always been strangely reluctant to discuss in any detail. Beside that name, in the same shaking hand, 3 words that I have not been able to stop thinking about since: she wants back. Not I want her back, which would have suggested a keeper's own longing, some human confusion mistaking wind for a voice, the way I nearly had. She wants back, a third party, referenced, someone or something else entirely, wanting something that only made sense if you understood it as belonging to whatever haunted those rocks, rather than to any lonely human keeper recording their own grief. I sat with that logbook for a very long time, piecing together what it implied, what it meant that something out there had apparently learned my mother's voice directly from her, decades ago, during whatever brief and evidently significant time she'd spent at this place, before fleeing it in the hurried, unexplained manner my sister's letter described. It had learned her voice the way you'd learn a language, thoroughly, intimately, and had apparently been practicing that language on subsequent keepers ever since, refining it, waiting for opportunities to use it, waiting perhaps specifically for someone connected closely enough to her that the resonance would land with maximum effect. I had walked into that waiting, unknowingly, grieving and alone, and exactly the kind of vulnerable that made me the perfect audience for a voice that had been rehearsing for my arrival for longer than I had been alive. That night the knocking returned, and I knew immediately, even before I'd fully surfaced from the light doze I'd fallen into on the pantry floor, that something about it was different this time. 3 raps, as before, but slower now, spaced with a deliberate gentleness that felt almost like an apology, almost like tenderness, which was somehow far worse than the flat, mechanical knocking of that first night had been. And this time, my mother's voice followed it immediately, close against the wood of the door, close as breath against my ear, despite the door and the wall between us, close in a way that felt like proximity shouldn't have allowed. "Wren," it said, in exactly her cadence, exactly her particular warmth, the specific quality of tiredness and love mixed together that had characterized her voice in the last months of her illness, when even calling my name had cost her visible effort. "Come see, I've missed you, love." I want to describe honestly what happened in my body in that moment, because I think it matters more than any description of the voice itself. My hand found the doorknob before I had consciously decided to move at all. I was already standing, already crossing the kitchen, already reaching, my rational mind trailing several steps behind my body's instinctive, grief-driven response. I stood there, in the dark, with my hand actually resting on the cold metal of the doorknob, cold sweat gathering along my collar despite the chill of the cottage, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and everything I had learned over the preceding days, the logbook's warning, "Don't answer, don't ever answer," the shape on the rocks, the pattern of keepers who had presumably not survived learning what I now knew, all of it sat burning behind my eyes, present and screaming and entirely, terribly insufficient against the specific, undignified force of wanting to see my mother's face one more time. I thought about the funeral. I thought about standing dry-eyed in that black dress while my sister sobbed, about how I had never gotten the chance to say the things I hadn't known, in the moment, that I needed to say, that I was sorry for the years I'd spent being the practical one, instead of the affectionate one, that I loved her more than my composure had ever let me show, that some part of me had been waiting my whole adult life for a moment of quiet honesty between us, that illness had stolen before I'd found the courage to create it myself. Grief makes fools of the smartest people. I had always believed myself too rational, too grounded, too skeptical, to be taken in by something as obvious as a voice through a door claiming to be someone I'd lost. Standing there with my hand on that cold doorknob, I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than anything else that night, that I was not smart enough tonight. That rationality is a thin, fragile thing when set against a hunger deep enough, and that mine, apparently, went deeper than I had ever let myself know. I didn't open the door. I want to be clear that I don't fully understand why, even now. Some instinct won out over the pull of that voice in the final second. Some thread of self-preservation, thin enough that I can't take much credit for it, but present nonetheless. Instead of turning the handle, I lowered myself slowly to the floor and pressed my eye to the narrow gap beneath the door, where a sliver of pale moonlight cut through from outside, thin and cold against the dark kitchen floor. What I saw through that gap was worse than the shape on the rocks had been, worse in a way that I have struggled, in the time since, to fully articulate, even to myself. It was my mother's shoes, her actual shoes, the brown ones, the specific pair she'd been buried in, a detail I recognized instantly and with total, sickening certainty, because I had been the one to choose them, standing in a funeral home 3 months earlier, trying to decide what she would have wanted to wear into the ground. Those shoes were standing just outside the door, positioned the way feet stand when someone is waiting patiently, wait settled, unhurried. But they were filled with something that was not quite feet. I could see it through the narrow gap, some pale, mottled substance visible at the shoe's opening, where an ankle should have been, something that shifted and settled the way wet sand does when you press your hand into it and pull away, a slow, viscous resettling that had no business existing inside a pair of leather shoes. Above the shoes, where legs should have risen up into a body, into my mother, into anything at all, there was nothing, no legs, no shape, no continuation upward into anything I could recognize as human, or even as approximately human, just the shoes, planted there in the moonlight, and the voice, which continued regardless of whatever occupied or failed to occupy the space above them, still calling my name in my mother's exact cadence, patient as the tide, patient as something that had been practicing this particular patience for far longer than my entire lifetime. I don't remember moving away from that gap. I remember, next, being pressed into the corner of the kitchen furthest from the door, knees drawn up to my chest, one hand clamped over my own mouth to keep any sound from escaping, watching the thin strip of moonlight beneath the door and the shadow of those shoes that remained perfectly, unnaturally still within it for what felt like hours. The voice continued for a long time, unhurried, occasionally shifting its words slightly. sometimes calling my name, sometimes asking gentle, wounded questions about why I wouldn't come see her, sometimes simply humming, low and tuneless, a fragment of a lullaby I recognized from childhood and had not heard in over 20 years, sung in a voice too accurate to be anything but memory made audible, memory given form and patience and an appetite I still couldn't fully name. At some point before dawn, unable to bear another moment crouched in that corner listening to my mother's voice work through its patient repertoire of grief and longing, I made the decision to abandon the cottage entirely. I moved fast and low, the way you might move through a space you believe to be under observation, and let myself out the small side door that faced away from the front step, away from whatever still waited patiently there in the moonlight, and made my way up the tower stairs 2 at a time, lungs burning, legs shaking with adrenaline, and exhaustion in equal measure. I bolted myself into the lamp room at the top, the great light turning its slow, blinding rotation beside me, close enough that its brightness left after images swimming across my vision every time the beam swept past. I don't fully know why I believed the light would help, why some instinct had driven me toward it, rather than toward the satellite phone, toward any more conventional form of safety. Maybe it was simple animal instinct, drawing me toward the one source of brightness and warmth, available in an otherwise entirely dark and hostile landscape. Maybe it was something more specific than instinct, some inherited understanding, passed down through generations of keepers who had apparently faced this same choice before me, that the light itself was the one honest thing at Merrow Point, the one element of the place that only ever did exactly what it was built to do, turning and turning regardless of what waited in the dark below it, indifferent in a way that felt, that night, like the closest thing to safety I had access to. Below me, muffled by distance and stone, but unmistakable nonetheless, I heard the knocking begin again, against the tower door this time, lower down, near the base where the stairs began, patient and testing in a way that made my stomach drop with a fresh wave of terror. 3 raps. A pause, long enough that I began to hope, foolishly, that it had given up. Then 3 more raps, exactly as measured and deliberate as before, working its way methodically around the tower's base, as though searching for a way in, as though the cottage door's failure had simply redirected its patience elsewhere rather than exhausting it. I sat with my back against the cold, curved wall of the lamp room, watching the light turn, listening to that knocking work its slow circuit around the stone below me, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its total bleakness, that I would not be sleeping again that night, and possibly not for many nights after. Dawn came grey and reluctant that morning, arriving not as a clean break from darkness, but as a slow, grudging concession, the black sky over the water softening by degrees into a flat, colourless pewter that offered no real warmth despite the sun being visibly present somewhere behind the haze, a pale smear of brightness with no discernible edges, no true disk, nothing you could point to and call the sun in any meaningful sense. The fog thinned only slightly with the light, enough to reveal the shape of the shoreline rocks below the tower, enough to make the world feel marginally more solid than it had through the long hours of the night, but not enough to feel like relief exactly. I had learned, by then, not to trust daylight the way I once had. I had learned that daylight at Merrow Point was less an absence of danger than a pause in it, a held breath on the part of whatever lived in that water, patient enough to wait out the hours when it was least likely to be believed. The knocking simply stopped at some point during that grey transition, and I want to be honest that I couldn't pinpoint the moment it happened, not with any real precision. There was no final knock, no clear conclusion, no sense of a door being closed on the encounter, the way a scene closes in a story someone tells afterward with tidy edges. It simply thinned out of my awareness, the way sound sometimes does, when your body has been rigid with fear for so many consecutive hours that the fear itself becomes a kind of background static, indistinguishable after a while from the ringing silence that follows it. I only understood the knocking had actually stopped when I realized, with a strange, delayed shock, that I had been sitting in complete stillness for what felt like a long stretch of time without hearing it, and that the absence itself had a texture, a weight, entirely separate from the sound it replaced. I climbed down from the lamp room slowly, my legs barely willing to hold my weight after a night spent rigid against the cold, curved wall, every muscle in my body aching in that specific, deep way that comes not from exertion but from prolonged fear, from hours spent braced and unmoving, ready to run or fight or do something, anything, that never actually came due. My hands shook against the cold metal railing of the spiral stairs. I remember counting the steps as I went, an old habit from childhood, counting things to keep my mind occupied when it threatened to spiral somewhere I didn't want it to go, and I remember losing count twice and starting over, my mind clearly not as steady as I wanted it to be. I made my way back toward the cottage cautiously, skirting wide around the front step, half convinced I would find the door damaged somehow, the wood splintered or scored, some visible evidence of the patient, methodical effort I'd heard circling the tower's base through the long hours of darkness. I braced myself for that image before I even rounded the corner, tried to prepare some part of my mind for whatever mark might have been left behind, some proof, at least, that what I'd experienced had a physical dimension I could point to, document, believe in, with something more solid than memory alone. The door was untouched, completely, disappointingly, unsettlingly untouched, still locked exactly as I had left it hours earlier, the same faint scuff near the handle that had already been there when I arrived at Merrow Point months before. Nothing new, nothing altered. There was frost gathered along the stone step, a thin silver crust that had formed sometime overnight, and it too was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no depression suggesting weight had rested there, nothing at all to indicate that anything had stood at that threshold for hours, calling my name in a voice I would have known anywhere, in any lifetime, under any circumstance. I crouched down and studied that frost for longer than was reasonable, running my fingertips just above its surface without touching it, as though close enough proximity might reveal some hidden disturbance invisible from a standing height. There was nothing. I might have convinced myself, standing there in that unconvincing grey morning light with my breath fogging in front of my face, that I had imagined the entire night, the shoes filled with something that moved like wet sand resettling, the voice against the wood close as breath, the slow methodical knocking working its way around the tower's stone base hour after hour. I wanted, badly, to believe I had imagined it. Exhaustion does strange things to perception, I told myself, standing there with cold seeping up through my boots from the frosted stone. And grief does stranger things still, and I had both in abundance, a combination potent enough to explain almost anything my mind might have manufactured in the dark. I nearly managed to talk myself into that comfortable, rational explanation. I nearly managed it entirely. Except that when I finally let myself back inside, moving through the small rooms with a wariness that had become entirely automatic by then, checking corners out of habit, rather than any real expectation of finding something, I made my way to the kitchen radio, more out of routine than genuine hope of contact, my fingers finding the familiar dial without much conscious thought behind the motion. It crackled to life almost immediately, for the first time in 4 days. I want to describe what happened in my body in that instant, because the physical sensation has stayed with me more precisely than almost any other memory from that entire 9 months. My whole chest seized, a strange, contradictory mixture of relief and dread arriving simultaneously, my hand freezing halfway to the handset as the static resolved itself, gradually, into something with shape and cadence. It was not Inez's voice. I knew that before a single word had fully formed. Knew it from the texture of the static itself, from some quality in the silence beneath the hiss that felt wrong in a way I couldn't have articulated if you'd asked me to. The voice that came through was calm, warm, achingly, unbearably familiar in exactly the way the voice at the door had been the night before. My mother's voice, unmistakably, every inflection and cadence perfectly, cruelly intact. But different now, in some register, I could feel more than name. It carried an authority I hadn't heard in it the previous night, a knowingness, a settled confidence that felt entirely distinct from the pleading, gentle tone it had used calling to me through the cottage door, that soft, wounded "come see, I've missed you, love," that had nearly undone me hours earlier. This voice sounded like it had already won something, like the pleading had simply been the opening move in a longer game, and this, now, was a different stage of that same patient strategy. "Wren," it said, and the static crackling around the single syllable of my name somehow made it feel more intimate rather than less, more present, as though the distortion itself were a kind of proximity, a closeness that had no business traveling through wires and relay towers and whatever mechanism actually carried radio signals across that stretch of black water. "You did so well staying inside." A pause, filled with nothing but the faint electric hiss of an open channel, a silence that felt deliberate, theatrical almost, as though whatever spoke through that radio understood the value of a pause the way a skilled performer understands it, knew exactly how long to let it stretch before continuing. "I'm proud of you, love." I stood frozen in the kitchen, handset gripped in a hand that had gone entirely numb, staring at the small speaker grill, as though I might see something there, some visual confirmation of what I was hearing, though of course there was nothing to see, just the ordinary grey plastic housing of a radio that had suddenly become the mouthpiece for something I still didn't have adequate language for. The voice continued, softer now, almost tender, carrying that specific quality of encouragement my mother used to use when I was young and frightened of something ordinary. A thunderstorm, a dark hallway, the first day of a new school year, the exact particular warmth she'd bring into her voice when she wanted to coax me towards something rather than force me. "Come down to the water now," it said, just for a minute. I dropped the handset. I remember the sound of it clattering against the kitchen counter, with a clarity that has outlasted almost every other sound from those 9 months. A sharp plastic crack that felt, in the moment, like the loudest thing I had ever heard, loud enough that some distant part of my mind worried absurdly about whether it might damage the equipment, as though equipment damage were a reasonable concern, given everything else happening around me. The voice continued for a moment longer even after I'd dropped it, still calm, still warm, murmuring something I couldn't fully make out from where the handset had landed, before the static swallowed it back into nothing, that same hollow hiss returning as though nothing at all had interrupted it. I stood there for a long time afterward, not moving, staring at the handset lying on the counter where it had fallen, cord dangling, connection presumably still open though silent now. And I understood something in that moment, with a certainty that settled cold and permanent into my chest, displacing whatever fragile comfort I'd tried to construct for myself standing on that frosted step minutes earlier. Whatever this thing was, it was not confined to the cottage door. It was not limited to a single approach, a single method, a single failed attempt before retreating to regroup and try again another night through the same channel. It had reached me now through the radio, through the one remaining thread I had genuinely believed still connected me to something real, something outside this place, something human. Inez's voice, however infrequent and clipped it had become, had represented the last tether I trusted implicitly, the last channel I hadn't yet learned to doubt. And now that channel had been compromised too, or overtaken, or simply revealed to have never been quite as separate from Merrow Point's hunger as I'd assumed. If it could reach me there, through wires and relays and whatever distance genuinely separated me from Inez's actual station down the coast. I no longer had any real confidence about where else it might reach me. What other channels I still believed to be safe might, in fact, already belong to it in ways I hadn't yet discovered. I thought, with a fresh wave of nausea, about the satellite phone in the drawer beside my bed, the one meant for genuine emergencies, and wondered, for the first time, whether even that would still connect me to anyone real if I finally worked up the nerve to use it. I am writing this in the lamp room where I have relocated more or less permanently over the past several days. Sleeping in short, fractured intervals on a nest of blankets dragged up from the cottage bedroom, I no longer trust myself to enter after dark. Door bolted below me, the previous keeper's logbook open on my knees beside the newer pages of my own, because I don't trust myself in the cottage anymore, and I don't trust the radio, and I am no longer entirely certain which voice, if either, I should believe carries more claim to being real, given that both have now demonstrated a fluency with my mother's exact cadence that goes so far beyond anything a simple haunting should reasonably be capable of, that I've stopped trying to categorize it as haunting at all. Haunting implies memory, echo, something faded and residual. What lives at Merrow Point is not faded. It has only gotten more precise, more confident, more fluent with each passing night, as though my presence here has been feeding it something it needed, sharpening whatever version of my mother it carries, the way practice sharpens any skill. The relief boat isn't due for 6 more weeks. I have counted those weeks obsessively, marking each day off on the kitchen calendar before I stopped returning to the kitchen altogether, and now I mark them instead on a scrap of paper tucked into this logbook. 41 days remaining as of tonight, a number that felt almost manageable a week ago, and now feels like an impossible distance, an ocean of hours I'm not certain I have the strength to cross. I checked the fuel gauge for the lamp's mechanism again this morning, a task I've made myself repeat daily now, with an anxious thoroughness I never applied to it in my earlier, more innocent weeks here, and found it running lower than the maintenance schedule suggests it should be, the consumption rate slightly higher than the previous keeper's records indicate as normal for this time of year. I don't know whether that's simple mechanical wear, some inefficiency in an aging system nobody has properly serviced in years, or whether it's something else entirely, something siphoning away, slowly and deliberately, the one resource that seems to keep whatever is out there at bay, or at least at a slight, negotiable distance, the beam's rotation apparently mattering to it in ways I still don't fully understand, but have come to rely on with the desperate, unreasoning faith of someone who has run out of better options. I think often, in the long hours I now spend awake rather than asleep, about the previous keeper's warning, the sentence that started all of this unraveling, the one that has run through my mind more times than I could possibly count since I first found it, water-stained and smudged, behind that boiler in the utility closet. Don't ever answer. I understand it now in a way I simply didn't when I first read it, sitting on the kitchen floor, in what feels now like a different, more naive lifetime. It wasn't only advice about a door, though I initially understood it that narrowly, that literally. It was advice about a hunger, about the specific, patient, generational hunger of something that lives in the black water below this rock, and has learned, across decades, perhaps longer, exactly how to use love and grief and loneliness as a kind of key, fitting itself precisely into whatever shape a person is most desperate to open the door for, reading each new keeper's particular wound and reshaping itself accordingly, endlessly patient, endlessly adaptable, limited only by the raw material each new arrival happens to bring with them. My mother knew it once. I keep returning to that fact, turning it over and over, trying to understand what it means about her, about the years I thought I knew her, about the woman who raised me and never once mentioned this place, this specific formative terror buried somewhere in her early 20s, that she apparently locked away as thoroughly, and permanently, as she locked away the box of letters my sister eventually found. She knew this thing well enough to flee Merrow Point in a hurry, decades before either my sister or I was born. Well enough that whatever happened to her here left a mark deep enough to keep her silent about it for the rest of her life. Through marriage and children and every ordinary domestic year that followed, never once slipping, never once letting either of her daughters glimpse the shape of whatever she'd survived on this rock. And it remembered her, long after she was gone from this place, long after she'd built an entirely separate life hundreds of miles away, long enough that she died of an entirely unrelated illness, in an entirely unrelated hospital bed, with no reason to believe anything from her youth had followed her. It remembered her well enough to recognize her echo the moment I arrived, grieving and alone, and exactly, precisely vulnerable enough to be useful to it, in a way she, presumably, had eventually learned not to be. I keep thinking about how tired I am of being the one who has to be strong. That thought arrives now with an exhausting regularity, unbidden, at all hours, threading through everything else I try to focus on. The practical one, the dry-eyed one, the daughter who handled the prescriptions and the appointments and the difficult late-night conversations with doctors, while my sister processed her feelings out loud to anyone patient enough to listen, while I sat alone with mine, coiled tight somewhere beneath my sternum, waiting for a permission to grieve openly that I apparently never learned how to give myself, not at the hospital, not at the funeral, not in any of the quiet months that followed. I think that hunger, whatever it truly is beneath the water at Merrow Point, understands that particular species of tiredness better than any person in my life ever fully has. Better even than I understand it myself. I think it has been listening to keepers confess exactly this kind of exhaustion for generations. Patient as the tide that shapes these rocks. Patient as something that has nowhere else to be, and nothing else pressing to do except wait, indefinitely, for the next arrival tired enough, lonely enough, sufficiently starved for a particular kind of love, to finally stop holding the door closed against it. I found myself, earlier tonight, standing at the top of the spiral stairs leading down from the lamp room, looking down into the dark stairwell toward the cottage below, and I caught myself listening, not with dread exactly, though dread was certainly present, but with something uncomfortably close to longing, some small, exhausted part of me, wondering what it would cost, really, to simply go down, to open that door, to let whatever waits there finish whatever it's been so patiently building toward. I recognized that thought as dangerous the moment I noticed it forming, recognized it as exactly the kind of thinking the previous keeper's warning had tried to protect against, and I made myself turn away from the stairwell, made myself return to this logbook instead, made myself write all of this down as a kind of anchor, a tether back to whatever version of myself still wants to survive this, rather than simply wants the exhaustion to end. I don't know if writing it down will matter. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, whether the next keeper, if there is a next keeper, if the agency doesn't simply quietly discontinue the position the way it apparently should have decades ago, will find these pages behind some boiler or wedged into some forgotten drawer, water damaged and half legible, the way I found the warning that started all of this. I think about that possibility often now, the strange continuity of it, the way this place seems to pass its keeper's fear forward like an inheritance nobody asked for, each of us leaving behind whatever fragments survive our own unraveling for whoever comes next, unwittingly building a kind of relay, a chain of warnings that never quite arrives in time to actually prevent what it describes. Tonight, when it knocks, and I no longer let myself pretend, even for a moment, that it won't, I don't know what I'll do.